Good afternoon, everyone. How's everybody doing? Great, awesome. The weather's finally changing, right? So today, the purpose of the TRANSCOM show is to really allow you an opportunity to get a chance to discuss major topics on what's going on with the command and our ability to try to communicate throughout the entire command. Today's going to be a little bit of a unique TRANSCOM show, one unlike any other that we've ever had. And we've talked a little bit about transitions, new projects that are going on, trying to educate the workforce on where we're going with certain things. Today is more like a history lesson, and it's going to be great. As a kind of a Civil War history buff myself, I'm real into history. I'm really into it. When I got out to Travis as the wing commander, I started giving a talk to the audience on Joshua Chamberlain and the Battle of Gettysburg. Well, I forgot that I'm from Alabama and I was in California. They don't teach the Civil War a whole lot out in California, so my audience really had no idea what I was talking about, and I had no ability to really go deep into the subject. You were in for a treat because many of you may or may not know about Thucydides, but you have somebody that's really deep into the subject and can explain it. And so we're very, very lucky to have Alan Meisenheimer here, who is our political advisor to the TRANSCOM commander. And so, Alan, I'd like to welcome you here to the TRANSCOM show. Thanks for taking the time to be here. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Really pleasure. Thank you.
I'll try not to sneeze into this microphone too much. But anyhow, so welcome to the entire team that's here and out there in DCS land. So, Alan, a lot of new faces. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. A lot of new faces, though, as we transition. We're starting to get into the PCS season as people will be rolling in and out. And so I want people that may not know you, many may have seen you or heard about your office and know what you do, but can you give us a little bit of background about what you do here at TRANSCOM and kind of how'd you get here?
Great. It's a pleasure. The POLAD program with the State Department used to be very small, because this started out many years ago with the State Department providing a senior advisor only to the combatant commanders of the big joint commands. And so that was a very small number of assignments for the State Department. But in conjunction with the intervention in Iraq, the program was greatly expanded. So we went from having about a dozen POLADs to having just about 100, because we're now at many constituent commands and component commands where we didn't used to be. That's been a very enriching experience for State Department officers who have opportunities that we used to not have to really get to know our military colleagues and to reinforce that connectivity between the military and diplomatic instruments of power, I think to mutual advantage. I have been a Middle East specialist for most of my career. I was also a POLAD previously in Iraq with First Corps. So I had some idea of what I was getting into here, but I was particularly motivated by that knowledge and that experience to want to come here because I understood from that experience how important the experience is for us and how we can really add value for the senior military commanders in making sure that the diplomatic give and take, which is going on everywhere all the time. You hear about confusion and chaos in the State Department, but that's not really the story. The story every day is that embassies around the world are interacting with foreign governments. They are putting out our point of view. They're articulating our requirements. They're hearing from the other side what we need to know in order to understand the international operating environment. And so that's what the POLAD office here tries to bring to the commander and to the senior staff. It's awareness of that daily diplomatic context of our country's interaction with the rest of the world.
Well, I think that's been absolutely crucial, and I had the great opportunity to join Alan and the commander on our trip to Africa last year after I first got here, and I saw the incredible value that it brought to the team as we go forward as a team and using all powers of the government to influence the process and educate on the process. So I'm also lucky as the Chief of Staff. I get to read a whole lot of stuff that your office produces on a daily basis, and I get to sit in the CUB, the commander's update briefing, and get an understanding of exactly what you bring to the team. Can you give an idea of the kind of products that you do produce for the boss regularly?
Well, on a daily basis, we look each day at the reporting cables coming in from our embassies around the world, we try to prioritize those which are relevant to the operational activities of our command. So that involves certain types of activity, certain regions that are particularly important to TRANSCOM, and we summarize those every morning and send those forward to the front office. We also look at speeches and statements and activities by the Secretary of State or other senior diplomats or diplomatic messages that are coming into the State Department that are relevant to our command's operations, and try to summarize those and get those forward to you as quickly as we can.
And we appreciate that for sure, but and I think it's important to note that he's not just there for the top deck, right? So for those directors that need their assistance, obviously they're always very, very willing and able to help. So Alan, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and we'll lead into our discussion of Thucydides. But the U.S. military is an enormous organization with thousands of people doing many different sorts of roles. The U.S. national security apparatus is even larger, including civilians engaged in a wide range of activities, including intel, diplomacy, and many other functions. So why do you think history, especially ancient history, is useful for people working in the national security enterprise?
Each of us has to have unique knowledge to do the unique jobs that each of us does in the national security enterprise. But it would actually be wrong for us to think that the things we do are without precedent, or that things that have been done in the past are not relevant to what we do. Reading history and knowing the examples of history, of course, won't tell us what we need to know today and won't make decisions for us. But history provides a sort of depth and distance that enables us to evaluate the decisions we have to make in a more objective fashion, and with the information of past examples, both positive and negative. And that can be really, really powerful. Destiny is shaped by human agency. And the agency that each of us exercises through our daily decisions needs to be informed not only by the native intellect that each of us brings to the job, but also by as much as we can possibly take in of things that have been done by our predecessors. Because as professionals in the national security enterprise, we're all part of a noble activity with a long history going back to the beginning of our country. And of course, in other countries, in other regions, in other historical periods, people have had parallel responsibilities to the responsibilities that we hold. So there are certain pieces of history that are especially relevant for what we do. The Civil War is certainly very relevant for us as Americans, and I think usefully informs what we do here. Thucydides is more useful than most because he was objective in analyzing not only the war that shaped his time, but in trying to understand war as a whole.
As I was very fortunate enough to attend the National War College, and at that point I learned that I wasn't reading nearly enough about history. And it made me realize that in our training of our civilian workforce and our military workforce, that I didn't believe we were doing enough reading about history, and it caused me to want to read more. And I noticed on the airplane on the way to Africa and back, you were reading constantly, almost the whole time. It might have been because you didn't want to talk to me. I'm not sure what it was about, but it really impressed me, the amount of time you took and the amount of time the boss took in reading and understanding history. Are there specific lessons we can learn about history?
History, I think, is directly relevant to what we do. I think each of us has to find the intellectual inputs that are agreeable to us, though. But I've found, as my career has gone on, that there are certain historians that loom large that I keep coming back to again and again. I find Machiavelli is really useful for what we do. Thucydides is top of the list. But since you've given me the opportunity to do so, I'll mention St. Augustine's City of God. Book 19 is a treatise on war that ought to be read along with Clausewitz and Sun Tzu and Thucydides. So there's just a lot out there, and I find that the more I read, the more I become conscious of what I don't know yet and need to know more about.
Because it can be dangerous too, right? Interpretation of history, because history is only what people have taken the time to write down, right? And seems to me that oftentimes the winners of whatever conflict get to write the history, right? And so we have to be careful, like we watch the news today, making sure that we're looking at the broad spectrum across the board, whatever political side you're on, right? So Thucydides' book is about a war between small Greek city-states 25 centuries ago. What makes it useful for us today?
Well, let me start moving the
please
slides
do.
forward as we go on. There are a number of things about Thucydides that are so remarkable, it's almost hard to overstate them. Because, as you say, sir, this book was written 25 centuries ago, and no one had ever written a book like this before, and there haven't been many written like this in the 25 centuries since then. I wanted to show this quote. This is why Thucydides says we should look at the past, not just because we have sort of an antiquarian bent and we're interested in learning about ancient things because they're inherently interesting, even though often they are, but that's not the reason. It's because we're professionals in this business, and in the business of war and peace, there's a lot that we can gain from looking at the past. Here's another insight from Thucydides that seems so obvious to us now, and yet no one before him had ever thought of economic power as a component, a major component of national power. Now, he's no economist, but he comes back to economic power again and again and recognized that that was a big advantage that the Athenians had at the beginning of the war that they squandered, and that was one major reason that in the end they lost the war. So looking at war, this is a definition adapted from Clausewitz. You think of a political objective. Here the political objective seems to be putting the spear in the other guy's skirt. But it's really much more complex than that when you think of the methodology that goes into achieving that objective. This is one of my favorite images from antiquity, and I think it's a classic image of war. This is Achilles and Ajax, the two great Greek warriors in the Trojan War. Now you can see they're wearing their helmets and they have their spears. They're ready to go into battle. But they're doing what soldiers have to do very often. They're waiting. And while they're waiting, they're playing a game. But the reason I wanted to put this up is to make the point that if we as national security professionals look back at the precedents that have been written about people in this business, it really can, I think, make you look at what you do in a whole different way. I know I've been seeing the command in a different way since we passed this slide around.
Yeah, you know, now that you say that about waiting, I don't feel so bad about doing Candy Crusher on my computer in my office. You know, so.
That's why it's there, sir.
So before we go further into the history of Thucydides, can you just talk a little bit about the book itself? Just chat a little bit about the book itself, and how is it possible that among all the books that were written, how has it survived over time?
I think that's a really interesting aspect of this book. When you think of all the books that were written in that time, 2,500 years, or 25 centuries ago, 2,500 years ago, the number of them that has survived is absolutely minuscule. The reason for that, in the first instance, being that back then the materials that books were written on were highly perishable. So if your book was used a lot, or even if it was just sitting on the shelf for a long time, it would deteriorate and need to be copied over again by hand in due course. And unless the book found avid readership generation after generation after generation, at some point it would not be worth anyone's trouble to copy the book over again. The oldest copy of Thucydides that exists is from the 10th century, but nothing was actually printed until the 15th century. So the fact that this book survived even from this time is remarkable, because we know that the three famous playwrights from Athens, Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, each of them wrote dozens and dozens of plays that have been completely lost. We have very few of their works, and even though they were incredibly popular in their time, most of their works have perished. So we can't explain specifically why this book survived, But the short answer has to be because it was useful. It was found useful by generations of readers in many places who kept on recopying it, adding mistakes every time. So the Greek is very, very difficult, and Greek scholars hate working through the Greek text of it. But we have wonderful translations to work with, so we don't have to worry about that.
So as we talk about Thucydides and the thoughts of his on the causes of war, can you kind of elaborate on what he was thinking, what you believe he was thinking with the causes?
Yes, and I'll come back to that a little bit later on. But just to mention up front, Thucydides wanted to understand why wars occur. And that doesn't seem to have been a thought that anyone before him had had. They simply accepted war as something that occurs, like rain or a cloudy day. It's just something that happens to us. Even in that one glorious century that was the epitome of Athenian culture, the 5th century BC, Athens was at war 2 years out of 3 and only had 10 years of consecutive peace one time out of that century. So war was something absolutely natural, and Thucydides wondered why that is. So he tried to analyze why. His short answer is it does arise from human nature. He finds that human nature disposes us to conflict, and there are ways that we can make that better or worse through the operational decisions we make, but it seems to be something that is arising naturally out of the way we are. But he went a little bit further than that. He identified 2 terms that I'll come back to again at the end that had not been used this way before. And I promise I won't use any more Greek words besides just these 2. The first one is prophasis. The prophasis is the disposition that we as a citizenry have toward that other state. If our disposition toward them is basically favorable, then individual incidents, and these are aitii, precipitating events, even if the aitii are pretty severe and provocative, if we have a favorable prophasis, we're not likely to go to war. So that if, in our case, if the Prime Minister of Great Britain makes a disparaging comment about our culture, we're not likely to want to go to war with them. Whereas if, pick your favorite evil leader that really hates us, if that leader makes the same statement or a similar statement about us, it's much more likely to lead to violent consequences. So you have prophasis, an underlying predisposition, and then aitii, precipitating events that, in the case of the Peloponnesian War, this war between Athens and Sparta, led to this 27-year conflict that ended the great period of Greek culture. It might have been avoided, or it might have been inevitable given the circumstances. And I'll come back to that point as well.
So do you believe that he saw war as inevitable then?
That is something that has never stopped being debated among people who read Thucydides. One of the things he says right up front is, I'm going to lay out the causes of the Peloponnesian War so that people years hence will never have to wonder why such a huge and consequential war occurred at this time in this place. And in fact, that's the one thing he spectacularly failed at, because we've never ceased discussing why in the world they had such a huge and consequential war in that time at that place. There is one passage, and we'll come back to this in a few minutes, where he uses a term that is similar, it's close to inevitable, but that's not the conclusion if you look at the book as a whole. And if you'll permit me, I want to run through just a couple of slides here.
Yes, please.
I want to put these slides up. We've got timeline number 1, timeline number 2, timeline number 3. I'm putting these up just to show you how we are not going to talk about Thucydides today, but I did want to show, if any of our colleagues from the J2 are here, I wanted to show them that the POLAD office also knows where the small fonts are. And we're able to produce the slides, but that's not what we're going to do today, because we don't have time for that, for one thing, and that's not also the most conducive approach for what we need to try to take from the book in the short time that we have today. If I may, I'd like to just set the stage for the war. We've used a map of the contemporary Aegean Sea, just so everyone can get where we are in today's world. If you imagine over on the Turkey side that's the Persian Empire, And the Persian Empire is expanding. And they would like to expand right across the water into Europe and right over into Greece. Now, prior to the Persian Empire arriving in that part of Asia Minor, all of the people who lived there were Greek. It was a Greek area. It was part of Greece culturally. And so when the Persians began pushing into that region, the Athenians and a few others, but mainly the Athenians, sent troops to assist the Greeks in trying to resist the Persians. Now, they did not succeed. The Persians conquered the entire area of Asia Minor, and then they looked rather angrily across the Aegean at the Athenians, who had tried to block their forward progress. So in the year 490 BC, they send a large invasion force that lands at Marathon, not far from Athens, with the intent of punishing the Athenians. Now, the other Greeks, when the Athenians approached them and said, we need to get together to repel this invasion, the other Greeks said, well, thanks very much, but that looks like an unbeatable force, and after all, you provoked them, so you Athenians need to take care of this. So the Athenians did. They went with only their staunchest allies from the city of Plataea, and they defeated the Persians on the beach at Marathon against all odds and against all expectations. It was a thunderbolt in the history and culture of that time. But a bigger one was coming, because only 10 years later, the Persians come back again with an infinitely larger force, an absolutely unbeatable force, the largest military force put together in the Western world that we know of up until that time. And this time, the Greeks were more inclined to get together, but it still looked like a terrible, terrible situation for the Greeks. How can they possibly defeat this invading force? Well, the Persians pushed their way into Athens and destroyed the city. They didn't leave one stone on top of another. Everything was razed. The Athenians put everything into their fleet. They embarked the whole population on their ships and evacuated them to safety, and then came back to fight. And as anyone who's gone to the movies in recent years is aware, the combined Greek city-states defeated this unbeatable Persian invading force through the combined combat power of Athenian ships and Spartan abs. This was an unbeatable joint force that the Greeks had never assembled before on their side, but they were not able to sustain it. After the defeat of the Persians, the Greeks again were divided, and through years of give and take between Athens and Sparta, enmity rose and misunderstandings increased, and within a number of decades, we end up with the Peloponnesian War that begins in 431 BC. Now, the story now is up to where Thucydides begins. And I'd like to say just a few words about the historian.
Please.
We really don't know very much about him. There are 5 surviving busts, and I say surviving because they're from various periods of antiquity. Probably not one of them actually looks like Thucydides. This is my favorite one. It's from the Royal Ontario Museum in Canada. Thucydides is from a noble family, and one of his forebears was one of the heroes in that Battle of Marathon. But we know virtually nothing about him before the year 424, after the war has been underway now for 6 years, when he's elected one of the 10 generals who are elected each year in Athens. And you'll see here that he's exiled from Athens in the same year. His military career was tragically short because the one mission he was given, he failed at. He was supposed to protect the strategically important city of Amphipolis. It's where the Athenians got their wood to build all the ships. So it was really important. And he had 7 ships to defend Amphipolis, but when the Spartan army arrived under the walls of Amphipolis, completely undetected, they arrived and no one knew they were coming. His force was a half-day's voyage away, so they arrived too late. And so what the sovereign people of Athens did in those circumstances is to vote. And this is the vote for ostracism, where his name has been scratched onto a fragment of pottery. And this is an actual ancient fragment of pottery with Thucydides' name scratched onto it. So he is exiled from the city. This is a disaster for him as a general because his career is over. It's a disaster for him as a citizen because he's exiled from the city. But for the historian Thucydides and for all the rest of us as readers of Thucydides, well, it's the best thing that could have happened because he spends the next 20 years traveling, gathering information, sifting information, interviewing people. He only says a little bit about this, but he says he was present with both sides, especially the Peloponnesians, that's the Spartans. Some scholars believe that he actually traveled to Sicily and was there when the Athenian army was defeated. Spoiler alert, that's coming up in just a minute. We don't know if he was actually there. But we do know that he avidly sifted and collected and edited and re-edited his text to put together the book that has come down to us. Now, this map, I can't account for the color scheme, but I like it because it shows you how the war between the Spartans and the Athenians engaged literally the entire Greek-speaking world in the Aegean. And in fact, it engaged Greek-speaking city-states all the way from Iberia to the Crimea. So the entire Mediterranean world is affected. There are more than 1,500 Greek city-states that were involved to one degree or another. But this shows the basic breakdown between those aligned with the Athenians and those aligned with the Spartans. Neutrality was not an easy option at the time. And we'll have a bit more to say about that in a few minutes as well. Now, this is the breakdown of the book. When I say book 1, book 2, Thucydides' history is divided into 8 different books. We're pretty sure Thucydides did not divide it that way. One of those unknown copyists who accounted for the survival of the book divided it this way. But it's a pretty convenient breakdown. You can see books 2, 3, and 4 suggest a plan of 3 years per book. And then the Sicilian expedition was such a huge operation, and it did determine the outcome of the war, so 2 full books go there. But Thucydides leaves off in mid-sentence in the 21st year of the 27-year war. So it appears that he probably did not live to complete the work, but we ultimately don't know what happened to him. I want to say just a little bit about book 1, which often is glossed over because it's preliminary. The war hasn't even started yet. But book 1 actually is essential to understanding the way Thucydides approached the analysis of war. And I think it's a clue as to how we might benefit from reading history as well. He includes a survey of Greek history back to the earliest times he could detect, because he thought that understanding how these Greek city-states came into conflict required you to understand how their culture evolved to begin with. You have to have a broad context in which to understand them. And then there's an intensive study called the Pentacontatia. It just means the period of 50 years, in which he surveys in painstaking detail the 50 years of interaction between Sparta and Athens before the war breaks out. So he's showing you that this war may have been inevitable, but it's inevitable because of exactly what happened during those 50 years within this defined context between these 2 states. So that's not a principle of inevitability that you can easily take and apply elsewhere. He's being very, very specific. But many of the things he analyzes in that 50 years of interaction are aspects of international relations that we can look at today and to a degree hope to emulate in our own reading of history and the application of it to our current national security enterprise.
Right, and he didn't have Wikipedia, right, to look it up on, right? So it's
There are a couple of times where he says, we can't go back earlier than that because nothing is known.
Mm-hmm.
If he'd had Wikipedia, he could easily have gone back further.
It would have been good. So does the pattern of war between Athens and Sparta have parallels in other wars since the 5th century BC?
That's a loaded question.
Mm-hmm.
And the short answer certainly has to be yes, but it's a tricky one to answer, because the pattern of the war between Athens and Sparta has been applied by scholars and diplomats and political leaders in many, many places, so many in fact, that it seems improbable that they could all be valid applications. Scholars have applied the Athens versus Sparta model, for example, to aspects of our war in Vietnam, the US Revolutionary War. There's an article I read a few years ago from a 19th century naturalist who was writing about islanders on a Pacific island that were in a long-term war. And he decided to call one of them the Athenians and one of them the Spartans. And he analyzed their interaction and the way they conducted their combat operations in terms of Athens and Sparta. The outbreak of World War I has been analyzed by scholars from many countries, including by American scholars, as a parallel to the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. The outbreak of more than one revolution in Latin America has been looked at in terms of the outbreak of conflict between the Athenians and the Spartans. I can even remember being a young child, and Dan and I were talking about this just the other day, reading in the barber shop an article in Look magazine in which Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State at the time, was writing about the Cold War. And he said that we are Sparta, we are Athens, and the Russians, the communists, are Sparta. And he took many aspects of the war and applied it to the Cold War laydown. It struck me even at the time that he didn't want to take the conclusion, because actually the Spartans win the war, and you don't want the Cold War to come out that way. But there are actually reasons for thinking of us as the Athenians. I'll go on, if I may, and just show a few more things. We don't have a lot of time to go through the ins and outs of the entire war, because it's extremely detailed. There's tactical innovation, there is technical innovation, there are unexpected victories and unexpected defeats, just as in every war. And that's what makes it so useful, because there is such verisimilitude in the flow of the combat that can be applied to familiar experience today. But there are just a couple of episodes from the book that I'd like to tease out a little bit. First is the funeral oration delivered by Pericles, the Athenian leader in the first year of the war. This was an Athenian tradition to have a speech honoring those who fell in battle each year. And this is a very famous speech. It's still frequently quoted on patriotic occasions in our country and many others. That's one of the famous lines from it, but I wanted to highlight just a couple of others, where Pericles talks about democracy. Athens was the first democracy, and it used its military force to impose democracies on a number of other states, and those states became the allies of Athens. So that the breakdown of alliances between the Spartans and the Athenians almost aligns with a breakdown between oligarchy and democracy, but not quite. There's not a perfect dividing line, but that's an interesting pattern that establishes itself, because the Athenians wanted other Greek city-states to follow their model, and also to throw their cities open to the world, to cultivate refinement without extravagance, knowledge without effeminacy. I really like this one. I think if we could just add the airways, this could be a new slogan for TRANSCOM. We have forced every land and sea to be the highway of our daring. And then finally, as a city, we are the school of Hellas. That's something the United States has always thought of itself, and I think with good reason. We are the city on a hill. We like to see ourselves, in terms of Isaiah, as a light unto the nations. That ended up sounding rather arrogant and unsupportable from the Athenians, and I think we have to be mindful that it not end up sounding that way from us. Just after this very, very inspiring and high-flown rhetorical episode, Thucydides goes right into the outbreak of the plague in Athens. Now, he describes the symptoms of the plague in clinical, painstaking detail. Again, something no one had done before his time. He said, we don't know what this disease is, but I want to record the symptoms so that future doctors may be able to understand it. We still haven't for sure, by the way, but it's still being analyzed. But the point here is that from a high point of inspiring patriotism, he goes right into the complete breakdown of values and norms and social stability in Athens, because a third of the population died and a lot more became ill. Thucydides himself became ill, but he survived. Pericles died from the plague, and Thucydides says that fear of God and fear of human law, there was none to restrain them, so that there was a complete breakdown of order in the city. And yet, they did not open the doors to the Spartans. The war did not end, but it came very close to ending at that time. But then it gets worse. More terrible things happen. The Athenians had made an alliance with the city-state of Corcyra, and Corcyra had a powerful navy. There was every reason to expect that Corcyra would be a really valuable ally in the coming war. But the Corcyrians had a complete breakdown of their own in their society, an internal war between advocates of democracy and advocates of oligarchy, partisan rivalry and rancor, so that there were mutual massacres, assassinations, and exiles. And this is called stasis in Thucydides' Greek, not the way we use the term normally today, which means status quo. This is where one side stands up against the other, and there's a breakdown in civil order. This is important because in Corcyra, it completely neutralized their military capacity. They were not at all useful to the Athenians during the war. But this is just the beginning, because stasis affects every city in the Greek-speaking world over the course of the war. And the breakdown of order, the inability to put forward a combat-effective force because of that, becomes a factor on both sides throughout the war. And it causes massive suffering in all of these cities. This is another famous quote. "War takes away the easy supply of daily wants, and so proves a rough master that brings most men's characters to a level with their fortunes." And I would venture, sir, because we were talking about Syria earlier, this is one phenomenon that is, I think, highly visible today in Syria, as in Libya, as in Yemen, as in a number of other places, that the breakdown of the governing order in the society opened the way for a conflict which no one could end once it had begun.
Very complex, obviously. So what are the key takeaways that the contemporary reader can expect from this little book?
Well, let me run through one more thing, and I'll try to
Please
sum
do.
those up, because we don't have time to read the whole book today, but I do encourage everyone to do that if you're at all interested in the subject. And I dare say everyone is somewhat interested in the subject, because if you're not interested in it, it's interested in you, to paraphrase another thinker that we don't need to talk about a lot here. The Melian dialogue is another famous episode from Thucydides that is ethically and morally problematic. If you think of, again, the high-flown patriotic rhetoric of Pericles in the funeral oration, and then the message that the Athenian generals delivered to the Melians, you don't have the right to resist us, because right as the world goes is only in question between countries of equal power. And we're powerful and you're not. And in fact, in this world, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. The question that's always been asked is that what Thucydides thought? Did he think that was true? Or did he think that was right? Or did he think that was the way human beings behave most of the time? Because there have been readers of Thucydides and some of the translators of Thucydides who took this as the historian's opinion. And personally, I think that's wrong, but I'm not in a position to tell you for sure. But my view is that rather than trying to say Thucydides is all about patriotism and Pericles and the funeral oration, or he's all about the breakdown of order and stasis and the plague and the Melian dialogue, I think what he's telling us is all of the above. I think he's telling us that all of these things are true about human beings. We are highly idealistic. We do revere culture and the rule of law. We do want to build something that is great and that is worthy of our time on this earth. and that will be appreciated by others. We genuinely want to do that. But we also genuinely have this capacity for breaking down the norms and the structures of order and for doing terrible, terrible things to each other. All of those things are true. And that's what happens in war. All of those possibilities are unleashed and they become all mixed up and difficult to control. That's the single greatest reason to be very circumspect about going into war, because it's not going to be under your control in the way that you think it will. If war is necessary, as it often is in Thucydides' view, then you have to do it. But be mindful of these pitfalls that the Athenians were not mindful of in their time. Now, the final episode that I just want to mention briefly here is the Sicilian expedition. The war between the Athenians and the Spartans achieved an armistice, and it went on for several years. And during the armistice, the Athenians decided they would undertake another war. They were going to go and invade the city of Syracuse, another large and powerful democracy, 800 miles away, something no one had ever done before. And here's where the logistics comes into Thucydides, because the Athenians were able to outfit ships to transport this enormous expeditionary force with horses, again, something no one had ever done, to this very distant theater of war. And they had an enormous advantage when they first arrived, because the Syracusans did not contest the environment. There was one Syracusan who tried to urge the others, the Athenians are coming. I'm urging you, just send out some ships. Even if we don't attack them, it will deter them from coming straight here and launching their invasion immediately. Make them divert up to Italy and gather their forces and come at us more slowly. And the Syracusans refused to do that. They said, no, those reports must be exaggerated. They can't be coming with such a large force. And so they did nothing. And the Athenians landed and mounted their attack on the city, and they almost carried the day. There's a lot of almost in this war. But then they started making bad decisions, and the Spartans sent a very capable general to assist the Syracusans, and then things turned truly grim for the Athenians. They, against all expectation and seeming possibility, mounted an enormous reinforcement expedition, almost as large as the first one. So they sent a larger army than they had ever put in the field anywhere in Greece, 800 miles away, and it came to disaster. In the Asinaris River, as they were fleeing in abject flight with no water across a dry plain, they got to the river and stopped to try to drink water, and the Syracusans came upon them and killed a large number of them, captured the rest, and they ended their days in these large quarries here in Syracuse. So the Athenians, against all their advantages, their incredible wealth, their vast empire, the support of a network of alliances such as no Greek city-state had ever had or would ever have again after that, they lost the war. And so we'll come to summing up at the end, but I'll mention just here one specific way that the war has been appropriated and applied to another model in the current tense. And this is in terms of the Thucydides trap between China and the United States. Professor Graham Allison at Harvard in 2012 came up with this concept, and a lot of people have picked up on it. And the Chinese in particular, no Chinese official makes a statement or a speech to a Western audience these days or in recent years without mentioning the Thucydides trap. And it's derived from this brief passage, which seems to say the growth of the power of Athens and the alarm which this inspired in Lacedaemon, that's Sparta, made war inevitable. That's not quite a literal translation. But that's what Allison took as his basis for the Thucydides trap. And here I want to depart just a moment from the usual methodology. My son, as many of you know, is an ensign in the Navy, and he's seen me do these Thucydides presentations a number of times in different places, and he always tells me, Dad, you don't quote enough naval authorities. And so I wanted to go right to the top of the command chain. This is Admiral Akbar. And everyone knows his tagline, it's a trap. But when it comes to the Thucydides trap, which says that war is inevitable between the United States and China because China is a rising power like Athens, and the United States is a status quo power like Sparta, then we have to go to war. That's not a trap. It's just a trope. And we are not falling into a trap. War is not inevitable with China. But I came across this one just last night off of the electronic Chinese news network. This is a member of the senior Chinese legislative body giving a speech this week in Philadelphia, in which she reminded us yet again that the United States and China need to avoid the Thucydides trap. So ladies and gentlemen, if you didn't think you were going to hear Thucydides outside of this room this week, if you were at the Wharton School, you would have heard the Chinese talking about it in specific reference to their relations with us.
Wow. Well, listen, I want to thank you a lot for expanding our knowledge of Thucydides and for what you and your entire team right here in the front row do for us here at TRANSCOM on a daily basis. We really appreciate it. I want to take the time to open it up for any kind of questions that you have for Alan regarding anything, whether it's Thucydides or his job here at TRANSCOM as the POLAD. Any questions from here or from the outside DCS land? No questions? Okay. One question right here in the back. If you'll wait for the microphone so the folks outside can hear you.
Hi. Just a quick question. If you've never read Thucydides before, what's the best way to approach reading the first time?
That's a fair question. I could tell you just to get the book and start on page 1. And you're welcome to borrow mine. I always have it with me. But there are some good books that look at it analytically. And I would recommend, actually I do have this one here, I would recommend Donald Kagan's book. It's based on a course he taught for many years. It's called On the Origins of War and the Preservation of Peace. The best section of this book is on the Peloponnesian War, but he takes the perspective and analytical insights from the Peloponnesian War and applies them to World War I, to World War II, and also to the episode of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's a good place to start.
I actually asked him the same question. I said, is there a Thucydides for dummies? You know, dumb it down to my level. You know, so, but thanks for the question. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. Can you square the Thucydidean philosophy about human nature, fear, honor, and interest leading to these conflicts, with the sort of popular idea right now that's come out of Enlightenment philosophy, Steven Pinker and others, that we're getting better and we're not as prone to these kind of problems? Is there a way to bring those two into alignment, or are they just going to be in conflict?
I think that's a great question, and I think conflict and dissensus on that point is inevitable because that conversation needs to go on. The realists, including those in the room, will tell you that human nature is sort of on that dark side, and that conflict is likely, it's inbred, and they take their inspiration directly from Thucydides. Personally, I think they overinterpret what Thucydides actually has to say on that subject. Those who want to argue that there is amelioration, I think that's a problematic case, but I think that case is there to be made. And of course, coming out of after the Enlightenment, if you get into the existential period, the existentialists will tell you that there is no value to anything, and that there are no ethical standards, and that conflict and chaotic random conflict is inevitable. So we human beings are continuing to analyze ourselves, and I think all of these perspectives are helpful, but I would not say Thucydides has the final word, but I don't think I want to give it to any of those other authorities either.
There's one more. Yes, sir.
So thanks for the overview. As we all work daily in the sort of operational trenches of our tasks at TRANSCOM, developing policy and such, how can we best remind ourselves of how we fit, how our daily actions do truly fit into these broader policy considerations of our nation?
I think on the one hand, it's very simple. We work for the executive branch of government. We know who is the commander-in-chief. When the commander-in-chief issues an order, we know what we'll do. As citizens, we have not only the right, but the obligation to think critically and analytically about how best we do that. And I think the same lessons apply in looking at national security, whether the combatants tend to look like the guy on the right or the guy on the left. And here's a summary of some of the ideas that I think are relevant to that task, things that come out of Thucydides. Looking at fear, honor, and interest, those are the combination of factors that shape human decision-making in political contexts, both in war and in peace. That applies to us, it applies to our adversaries, it applies to our allies, and they all intersect on a sliding scale. That's a lot to take in, but just recognizing that, I think, instills humility and practicality that can be useful. Looking at prophasis and aetiai, that is the underlying disposition that we bring to issues, and then analyzing the precipitating events accordingly, and also trying to apply that to the other side. Thucydides thought that each country had a national character, and I think there's something to that. At least in reading Thucydides, he makes a convincing argument, and others have found echoes of that in subsequent conflicts. Being aware of the differing characters of one country to another can be relevant as well and useful in shaping our analysis of their decision making. Looking at the risk of stasis. When stasis begins, decision making is going to deteriorate. And if the actions we take are likely to precipitate stasis, that's something we want to be mindful of, because then everything that comes after will be less rational than everything that came before. Economic power is a huge component of national power. Secretary Gates talked about that, something that no Secretary of Defense had talked about before, and that's a major theme from Thucydides. Leaders make an enormous difference, even if you have the best system. In Athens always had the best system, but they often had terrible leaders. Their leaders made awful decisions, and that's why they lost the war. So leadership and leaders make an enormous difference. Allies and alliances make an enormous difference. Both the Spartans and the Athenians were manipulated by their allies. They made huge mistakes in trying to accommodate allies, doing things they would not otherwise have done. And then finally, and maybe worst of all, chance, just sheer random happenstance, is going to take a hand in ways that you cannot foresee. And this also is straight out of Clausewitz, but it's another way that Thucydides is particularly modern, because every Greek writer up until this time thought there were gods manipulating us, and that the gods had their contending agendas and they were manipulating us here. For Thucydides, it's just us. It's just human beings making decisions. Chance will enter into it, but the part of human activity that's under our control, we have to exercise that control in the most mindful way we can.
Thanks. Appreciate it. One more question, and then we'll wrap it up.
So, Ambassador, thank you very much. So that's a remarkable list and an impressive presentation. What I don't see on there is the diplomatic component of this. And throughout Thucydides' writings, there was that discussion of the warlike nature, the leaders, the importance of economic power. And yet, as we struggle today to not fall into that putative trap, we've continued to say that the third leg of the stool of economic power and of military power is diplomatic power. How did he address that in his book, in your mind?
You're absolutely right, and forgive me for underemphasizing that point today, because it's very clear from Thucydides that the diplomatic engagement between states is absolutely indispensable to national success. The Greeks actually were the first to organize diplomatic service in an organized, official way. The standards for recruitment were different back then, though. Diplomats were recruited mainly on the basis of having a very loud voice, because you had to yell your message to the other side, often across a field where you couldn't venture out there, and you had to make sure they could understand you. I think that we've become more selective in the State Department today. I'm not sure we get a better outcome, but that criterion is no longer emphasized in the way that it was back then. But in Thucydides, there are many episodes of negotiation, some in which shrewd negotiators get a good deal for their side, but more in which negotiators get carried away and ask for too much and end up squandering an opportunity for peace on favorable terms because they're trying to hold out for more concessions or for total victory and surrender from the other side. So absolutely, diplomacy is another equally problematic, difficult, and very human aspect of this interaction of conflict, in peace and war between these city-states in Thucydides' history.
Thanks, Colonel. Appreciate that. So I can't thank you enough for your time, but I want to take an opportunity quickly to introduce your team and to really recognize one of your teammates that's going to be leaving pretty soon. So on the front row here, we have Rachel Wolf, who will be leaving this summer. And Mr. Mike Masick, who just joined the team, and we're really happy to have you on board. So, yeah, thanks. Rachel, I want to just take an opportunity, if you'd come up here pretty quick. I got to embarrass you. Yeah, I got to embarrass you. I read a lot of Rachel's inputs to the team, and it's such a critical part of what we do and enables the boss to make some very, very important decisions. And on behalf of the entire team and all of TRANSCOM, just a small token of my appreciation, one of my dinner plates. But I just want to say thanks and best of luck to you and your family as you move on this summer. Thank you so much. Absolutely. Well, thanks, Ambassador. Thanks again for your time and the education. It's a continuous education here at TRANSCOM. We look forward to next month where Major General Select Lenny Rishu from the JEC is going to be here to talk to us a little bit about the JEC's overall mission and the complexities of running an organization that's as complex as that is. So please join us next month for Lenny Rishu's visit. So thanks again for your time. Appreciate it. Thanks again. Absolutely.